Richard, born in January 1913 in that little house on the brink of the cataclysm of World War I. The four Nixon boys who lived in that house were Donald, Arthur, Harold, and Richard. Born in Whittier after the family moved to Whittier in the early part of the 1920s was Ed Nixon. He was born in 1930, also a future wartime Navy veteran. He was born on the verge of the cataclysm of World War II. By then, Richard was 17, and he'll talk about this, but Richard was a brother, of course, but also a counselor and an advisor who often asked Ed tough questions as he planned his career and education. As Richard was at Duke Law School, Ed went to Duke University as an undergraduate, got his degree in geology, went on to North Carolina State for his advanced degree in geological engineering. He is an engineer. He has a passion for getting God-given resources out of the earth in a safe and an efficient way. And just as Richard Nixon had this sort of division in his own temperament between his hard-charging father and his peace-driven mother, you see in Ed, he's a scientist, but he's also a poet. And you see these influences vying in him. He may share some of his verse with us. And before the year is out, he will publish The Nixons, A Family Portrait, a long-awaited memoir from his perspective of this extraordinary and surprisingly little understood American family with such deep roots in our region. So as Dr. Naftali brings the Nixon Presidential Library to Yorba Linda, as Ed Nixon mines Nixon family lore, 2007 is going to be a very interesting year indeed in Nixondom. And so in that spirit, please welcome Ed Nixon. Welcome.
Wait till the important people are seated here. Dr. Naftali and Marjorie, distinguished guests, extended family. Didn't expect to see so many family members here, but it is a family time. The story I am trying to put together is to summarize 600 years of, as far as I can tell, history. That might surprise you, but my collaborator on this book, Karen Olson, has dug into it in depth. And my daughter, Beth, on a trip to Ireland and to Scotland, discovered that we were very likely related to the Braveheart folks in southern Scotland on my Nixon side. We can't prove it, there's not any paperwork, but the stories my father told and my aunts and uncles, probably true. And thinking of the kind of spirit that Frank Nixon displayed to all of the relatives, he didn't kill anybody, but he certainly spoke out. Spoke up. On the other side, we've discovered that the Edwards, the Plantagenet kings of England, were also on the Millhouse side. And when you think about that, from 1330, let's say, or the 1300 anyway, early 1300s, until 1907, 600 years it took for Braveheart and Longshanks to get together. What would you expect to come out of that kind of a reunion? The reality of it, though, is that heritage, as we look at our own heritage, each of us, even if you're orphaned, you can read about heritage in a family and be inspired. In reviewing our own, it's not so much looking way back in history and those long distant strains of where did we come from, as it is in your own experience, what you personally remember. And in our family, both the Nixons and the Millhouses, we had a great propensity for reunions. Some of us still do it. And in fact, some Millhouse folks down here up in the center of California still pull in a huge gang of Millhouse relatives every year. And the Nixons have pretty much disappeared, and that's because the Millhouses were more prolific in my time than were the Nixons. There are still a few of us around. My cousins in Pennsylvania have all gone except for Dimpy, my Uncle Ernest's youngest daughter. And I talk with her every week or so, trying to retrace what was it Doc Nixon, Ernest Nixon, my Uncle Ernest, the youngest of my father's brothers. He became a PhD and a teacher in agronomy, geology, I don't know what all, but he was the most inspiring person that I knew in my family as far as making you think and wonder about what's out there. Why did Mount Nittany come up like that and take that form all oriented in one direction? And he would explain these things, and I was fascinated as a kid listening to him tell the story. That wasn't the only one, though. My first trip across country was by car, you might suspect, going back to Duke University for Dick's graduation in 1937 from Duke Law School. On that trip, my grandmother, Elmira Millhouse, 82 years old at the time, would get cramps in her feet, and she said, "Frank, they have to stop." "What's the matter?" Well, I have a cramp. I must shake my foot." So she'd get out of the car and stamp her foot and get the cramp away, and off we'd go again. I don't remember that, but I was told that's why it took so long to get back to North Carolina. The next trip was by train. And Dick, by this time, was out of law school, practicing in Whittier. He was having arguments with Don about who's going to get the car for a Saturday night date. So Dick was successful enough, and he said, "We don't need to do this. I'll just get my own car." So he ordered a car to be delivered at Lansing, Michigan, the Oldsmobile factory, saving a little bit of money, and also he was curious about what the train ride would be like. So off we went. From Union Station, LA, he bravely suggested I should go with him. 9 years old at this time. And that train trip was a real experience. Never forget it vividly. The beauty of going through the Utah canyons and finally arriving in Chicago, changing trains to what my uncle, to my cousin Bill Millhouse called the clinkers, on up to Lansing, the short run. Arriving at the Oldsmobile factory, I looked at that car that Dick had ordered. Beautiful, black Oldsmobile coupe. Steering wheel, brake, accelerator pedal, and that was about it. But it was beautiful, shiny, smelled like a new car. And he said, "Eddie, now here's a map. I want you to see where we're going. We're going down to Chicago here, and then on Route 66 all the way back home." So I became a map reader from that point on, because he said, "Now if you see a straight stretch of road on there, long enough and straight enough, I'll let you sit over here and steer the car." I've always read maps ever since, looking for straight stretches of road. Coming across back home, we stopped at Claremore, Oklahoma, not far from the birthplace of Will Rogers, which is actually Oologah, not Claremore. But there was a museum there then, and Will Rogers had recently been lost in a crash with Wiley Post. And in that museum, there was a bronze statue, Will Rogers up there with his rope, and a plaque below that said, "I never met a man I didn't like." And I asked Dick, what did he mean by that? Can that be true? And Dick said, "Well, maybe he hadn't met everybody yet." A little farther along, we get into New Mexico, and I'm looking ahead, of course, looking for that straight stretch of road. And in Arizona, I spotted this thing that I didn't recognize, meteor crater. I said, Dick, what's meteor crater? I think he knew, but he said, I don't know, let's go see it. It's only a quarter of a mile off the road. In those days, it was a little dirt road, rough, up to the rim of the crater. And up there was a little shack and an old hermit-like character selling little bits of meteorite for 2 bits. So Dick bought me one of those, and I started asking Dick, what caused this huge hole in the ground, this great big crater? It's like 100 football fields all wrapped in one. And he said, well, I don't know, why don't you ask that fellow? It looks like he's been around here a while. And he said, I said, where did this come from? How did this develop? He said, well, it's probably a shooting star. You know, you've seen them. They call them meteors, and it looks like it impacted here and blew out all this huge hole in the ground. And I asked him then, where did the meteor go? Have they found it? He said, no, we just got little bits of meteorite. It must have blown up just before it hit. But here's another piece, or another bit, you know. I became curious then. Have they found that thing? Are they still digging for it? So immediately I said, what kind of people go looking for meteorites that have buried themselves in the ground? Geologists. Well, do they know where this meteor came from? No, that's for astronomers. From that point on, at the age of 9, I knew I was going to be either an astronomer or a geologist. I had to find out where those things were coming from. But the curious thing about that, when you think about it, Dick's influence on me through life, and this is just a sample of it, asking him questions is like asking the professor to give you a test. Because he's just not going to give you the answer unless you think through your question and have it thoroughly formed, and then he might make some suggestions as to where you might do some research. He led like that. His staff at the White House in those days, I remember, were challenged at every turn. Sometimes he suggested things that he actually, I think, never meant to be carried out, but they happened. When I come back to the world of the family, in 1966, I was in Washington, D.C. I was working on Project Apollo at the time, and Dick and Pat invited me to come up and have Christmas with the family. So we had a fine dinner there one of the evenings, and Julie and Tricia were there, Pat and Dick, and I'm sitting there wondering, what can we say, what can we do to teach these kids more about what the family meant? Unfortunately, I asked a question that was difficult for Dick to even think about. I said, Dick, I knew Harold for only 3 years of my life, and I never got to know him well enough. What can you tell me about Harold? Arthur had died 5 years before I was born, and I had curiosity about Arthur too. Arthur was not so hard for him to describe. He was a loving little chap, and sleeping sickness, they called it. We don't know what it was. Tubercular meningitis or something like that. Arthur preceded, and then Harold, at the age of 23, when I was 3, he had gone. And Dick began to tell the story about that last day. In our grocery store, Mom used to bake pies and mix dough and beat the eggs and so forth for cakes and whatnot to sell in the store. So Harold had the idea that we should give Mom something for her birthday, which is 2 days away. So they had shopped around and found a mixer, a new thing in those days, an electric mixer. And they thought that would be a wonderful thing. She wouldn't have to work herself to the bone, beating the eggs and stirring all the dough. But that thing cost $30. And in 1933, that was a lot of money. Somehow, they raided the till or something. They got enough money to buy that mixer. And the next morning, this was March 6th, 1933, Dick's describing the story. He said, Harold came in when I was shaving, getting ready to go to college, and he said, Dick, get out of here. And I said, well, I'm only half shaven. I'm not finished yet. And he says, that's all right. You got to go right now. I'm not feeling well, and I need to use the bathroom. So Dick left, and he discovered later that he had done the same with Don, got him off to school. Then he got down to, he went down to Mom in the kitchen on her birthday, and Dick couldn't tell the story. He broke up. So I knew then I shouldn't have asked that question, because he couldn't have answered it anyway. Harold died in my mother's arms. And when Dick came back from school, afternoon, he took the mixer down and gave it to her. Not good, but memories like that are easier to write about than they are to say. I almost decided I wouldn't tell that story today, and I probably shouldn't have, but let's proceed. When I was finishing high school, we were living in Pennsylvania. My last year of high school was in York, Pennsylvania. A marvelous country, Mennonites, Amish people, very conservative folks, where it was not common for kids going to high school to continue on beyond high school. High school was required by the state, but those folks said, you know, we need to keep our lives simple. We live on the farm, and my Uncle Ernest used to describe one of the sayings they had as most pertinent to the way they believed: be not the first to accept the new, nor the last to abandon the old. I think only 3 of us in that graduating class went on to college. But how I got to Duke is another story. I was a Californian. I had gone to school here, in grade school and high school, until that senior year when I was moved back to Pennsylvania. And that's in the book too. I'll get it out there. You'll read about it. But I wondered, why did Dick insist that I go to Duke? I said, I want to go to Stanford or Caltech. That's my world. I want to find out what the Earth is made of and what's out there in space. And he said, well, you can do that at Duke as well. Let's take a ride. At this point, he's in Congress. So one day, he was up to the farm on a Friday morning. He can't, you know, they don't work in Congress more than 3 days a week. So, so we proceeded down to Durham, North Carolina, easy drive. And he showed me around and introduced me to Dean Wanamaker and Dean Cox. And they persuaded me that I could do just as much at Duke as I could going back to California. And besides, I'd be closer to Washington, D.C. and learn something about how government works. And I could even be closer to home, which seemed to be something we like to have, close to home. Well, Duke was another reason that I had to think, why did he want me to go to Duke? Thinking of our heritage again, we were abolitionists across the board. Grandparents moved to Whittier because John Greenleaf Whittier was a good abolitionist poet, to be sure. And actually, as my cousin Howard Marshburn, who's kept so close track of it, noted that in Coleraine, Ohio, grandparents, great-grandparents, way back there somewhere, operated a station on the Underground Railroad, bringing slaves out of the South, moving them up to the North. And so many stories surround that I wanted to tell that story on a campaign trail, and I was shouted down by the blacks in a campaign speech. But I said, someday I'll tell that story. I may have to write it. But this mission that Dick had in mind was to expose me to the prejudice so that I would understand it firsthand. And going to Duke, I saw it. Of course, it's there, and they talk much the same way today, except they've really modified it now. And thanks to proceedings that Dick succeeded with when he was president, schools did finally integrate. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was a very important milestone, but the resistance continued, and 7 states in the South just had not brought it across. And there's a good bit of documentation on that. I'll have to ask Dr. Naftali to show me where to find it, but it's there. Dick had this idea that regardless of whether I become a scientist or whatever, I need to understand what it is to be a citizen in a free country where everybody needs to be free and equal. And indeed, I learned a great deal. Later on, working in Washington, D.C. During the 60s on Project Apollo, a lot of my cohorts were from Bell Labs in New England, and when the Civil Rights Act passed in '64, they said, you know, we finally got them now. Those folks down south are really going to have to toe the line. Going to be some real riots. And I said, no, you know, I know those people. I went to school there. You're going to have more riots in Boston than you have in Durham, North Carolina. And sure enough, there was a lot of trouble, and we still have trouble. The mission is this. We need to look at people around the world as people. When someone asks you, what race are you? Say the human race. They don't need any more than that. Sure, if you want to trace your heritage and look at grievances that may persist, don't carry the grievances into the new world. Teach your children it doesn't have to be like that. Be a human for a change. So that mission carried forth in my engineering mind, and I said, well, I can't do much except talk about it once in a while. I don't talk about it very well. I'm sorry about that, but it's there. I've tried to write some of that into the book, and I must mention the lady here who's here today, Karen Olson, who's the writer, who's putting it together. As I talk, she takes shorthand so fast and gets it out there that I've got a manuscript all of a sudden. And Karen, where are you? There she is. Please give Karen Olson my appreciation. Karen has her own story, and I'll have to put that somewhere in there if I can get her to write it down. In 1962, the World's Fair, Dick had lost the presidential race to Kennedy. He was in the gubernatorial race here in California, and he decided to come up to Seattle for the World's Fair. I don't remember what time of year it was, but the fair was only open for 6 months from spring to fall. And Karen had just had operations on her feet. So she wrote a letter to my brother and said, I'm sorry I won't be able to greet you when you come to Seattle, but I really admire your work, something to that effect. And lo and behold, as Dick and Pat come to town, Pat goes off to some kind of event, and Dick's going to do something else. Karen's mom, Karen Anderson's mom, said, what's this in the newspaper about President Nixon's coming to our house? Oh, I didn't know about that. And suddenly she's running around, running the vacuum cleaner, cleaning it all up, inviting in some schoolmates. And so Dick visited the house, and from that point on, Karen Olson has been a Nixon fan. Can you imagine why? We'll get this out. I had hoped to get it out a couple of years ago, but things happen in writing when you're not a writer. I can talk, and my tongue wags, but my fingers are very sluggish. And getting it into a computer is another world. I've learned how to type almost, but still hunt and peck, and that's too slow. So on we go. The story about Richard Nixon and how he became what he was. It doesn't say anything about how each of us boys became what we were, except that the heritage encouraged all kinds of interests. We weren't patterning anybody in our family to do this, and everybody else does it the same. We were each one different. My brother Don was a master entertainer, a host. He loved to cook. He loved good food. And everybody loved to visit Don. Dick, another type altogether. Thoughtful, needed a lot of time to contemplate what he was going to do, what he was going to say, and listening in a way that is a Quaker trait. We listen, we seek, and for each it is to determine what we believe. We are not told what to believe, but we are taught what is easiest and best to believe. And each of us has to determine it for himself. I'm reverting to Old English, to him or herself. That's another world we grew up with. Now we recognize women. Yeah, that's good too. Yeah. To conclude, what I might say here would be very difficult to do. I have to leave it to your questions, and I'm willing to do that. I could tell stories on and on and on, and they do reveal something, no doubt. But to each, it might mean something different, and that's what I would expect. I don't expect you to come out with the same impression of who I am or what I am or where I came from. You'll each have your own idea. And in God's world, that's what it's all about. But we're all the same in His eyes. And that's what's most important. Now, one more story here. Are there any teachers in here? Hands? There's a few teachers, yes. Really, we're all teachers as soon as we have children. The most important teachers in our society are first parents, then the first elementary teachers, and so on. Beyond that, if you don't get it when you're very young, it's very difficult to get later. When Dick was elected in 1968, my youngest daughter, Beth, 8 years old, wrote him a letter. We didn't know about it. Gay and I didn't know about it, that is. But about 2 years later, I have a call from Rose Woods, Dick's at San Clemente, and he says, your brother wants you to get your family together and come down to LAX, and we'll pick you up over there and bring you out to El Toro for a ride on Air Force One back to the White House. And I said, what's this about? He said, well, don't worry about it. When you get here, we'll tell you. So I had to take her word. That's like a command, you know, especially when Rose Woods spoke. She was the greatest. So we got together. We landed at LAX, picked us up in a nice limousine, and drove us over to El Toro. And Air Force One took us on a ride back to Andrews Air Force Base, landed, immediately disembarked, got on Marine One, landed on the south lawn of the White House. Pat was still there. She hadn't come west on that trip. So Dick led us into the diplomatic reception room right off the south lawn. And he says, "Now, girls," not addressing me, he's, "look around and you'll see phones here everywhere in the White House. And if you need anything or want anything, all you have to do is pick up a phone. You don't have to dial anything. Somebody will say, 'Can I help you?' Just say who you are, where you are, and what you want. Now let's go take a tour of the rest of the house." And Beth said, "But Uncle Dick, how will I know where I am?" "Oh, like Beth, I'm going to show you. Let's take a walk." So up we went, all the way up through every room, all the way to the top floor, which very few people see unless they're guests at the White House, and one of those administrations, they did that sort of thing. And in the top floor, there's a place called the solarium. And Dick said, "You'll notice here that the floor slopes downward and then down into this beautiful room with the glass. And this was fixed for President Roosevelt. You know, he was crippled. And in his wheelchair, he could roll his wheelchair down here, and he liked to come out at dawn and watch the sunrise and gaze out over the tidal basin and think about the day ahead." Then he took us back down to the second floor, the family floor, had dinner in the family dining room, and there's stories about that too. I got to stop here. The point was here, in the middle of the night, we thought we had the kids to bed. I think Amy did sleep through it, but not Beth, because her mom had told her, "Now you're going to be seeing things, and when you go back to school, you're going to have to tell about it. Show and tell is going to require that you have a good notebook," and Gay's always been a notebook keeper. You should see our house, it's full of notebooks. So Beth was very diligently determined to make notes on this event, and she decided to get up before dawn. And so about 5 in the morning, she's up there in the solarium, sitting down, waiting for the sunrise, and writing down everything she can see to describe. Pretty soon, she decided to test Dick's story about picking up a phone. So she says, "Hello, this is Beth. I'm in a solarium. I'd like a Coke and some cream corn. I'd like a phone." About 30 minutes later, white tie, tails, silver tray, Coke. Obviously, she wrote all that down. The story goes on, however, because after a couple of days at the White House in a most extraordinary stay with a relative, we were back home, and Beth went back to school, fully expecting to be able to tell her wonderful story. And teachers beware. The teacher wouldn't call on her for the rest of the year because the teacher was so politically correct. Didn't want to expose the other children to make them feel inferior. Think of the inspiration that was lost with that decision in that teacher's mind. Wake up. Tell your story. Tell it with heart and make people cry or laugh or whatever, but tell your stories. And that's where I will stop it here, because I know we have other things to do, or do we? I could tell a lot, but I really look for priming from people who are listening. And yes, go ahead.
Thank you, Ed Nixon. Let's give him a great hand for being here. We're going to do some Q&A. Brother Nixon's agreed to do some questions and answers, so I look to you for whoever would like to take advantage of this golden opportunity to ask the President's brother directly a question about him or his forthcoming book or about his brother. And I'll hand you the mic if you all would stand up and state your question. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your lovely stories, and I appreciate knowing that special, the day that you lost your other brother, Harold. I have a wonderful photo that I've only seen one time and have a copy of, and it is Richard Nixon, who's about 1.5 feet off the ground, jumps straight up with this most gleeful, wonderful, happy look. And he is the Vice President of the United States, and he's in the White House, and there's a big grandfather clock behind him. It's one of the most delightful photos I've ever seen of him. There's a person there that I think sometimes has not been recognized by the American public. Richard Nixon was often seen as almost a kind of a wooden, kind of a stiff personality.
Unfortunately, he was thinking. Yeah.
And I wondered if you might be able to share something that perhaps we've never heard before about this other side of him, in which he could really be very funny and very humorous. Thank you.
Thank you. The public perception of Richard Nixon as a glum, not very excited person is just so far off. If you, in a family setting, at a reunion or whatever, he came forth just animated and enjoying life of the party, really. But when he's with strangers, he wants to be sure where everybody's coming from in their mind before he goes off the deep end. He might have taken that a little farther when he was president, but it's a picture like that reveals a lot. There was a time down in Key Biscayne. He was living down there a while, and at a party, he was playing the piano, and everybody was singing, and after a while, he got up on the piano and started talking and making jokes and laughing. People don't see that. They haven't seen that because he was a proper man. He wanted to always appear respectable. And sometimes we act foolish, and he never wanted to look foolish. Well, what happens to humans? We are always foolish at some point. That's a good question, though. I wish I could see that picture.
In the rear here on the right, we have 10-year-old Keenan to ask a question.
Did you ever find out about the letter before you told us here? Like, did you find out, did he tell you about the letter that Beth sent?
Oh, that my daughter sent? Oh, yes. Yes, oh, I should have told you. When we got to El Toro and boarding the plane, Dwight Chapin, who was an assistant to my brother, he was on board, and he greeted us at the top of the steps, and he said, you know, I understand you want to know why you're here. So he handed me this letter, and he says, Dear Uncle Dick, I'm glad you were elected president. I'd like to come and stay with you at the White House. Please write and tell me when I can come. Because of that, being 10 years old, asking a question like that, I want you to write a book someday, too.
And in the rear here, 10-year-old Samira from Heritage Oak School.
Are you ever going to become president?
I didn't hear that.
Did you?
He's not.
Would you want to state it?
Oh, am I ever going to become president? Oh, I'm too old. Presidents have to be 35 years old, you know, at least.
Okay. Anybody? Okay. some of you were out at our ceremony at 10:30 and didn't have an opportunity to welcome Dr. Tim Naftali, who is our new director here at the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Museum. And he has a question. Please welcome Dr. Naftali.
When's lunch? No.
Right on.
You figured out that you were going to be a geologist or an astronomer in the car with your brother. When did you figure out that your brother was going to run for office and that he felt he had this calling?
People have asked that question. I could mark a time when Eldo West, Jessamine West's father, said Richard Nixon is going to be president someday. But that's when Dick was in Sunday school before I was born. I didn't hear Dick's answer at that time. So, but later on, in the 68 campaign was one that I was involved in. Before that, I was in the Navy and avoiding political action because of the Hatch Act and other things. And I really didn't know, except so many people were suspecting it. The thing that did happen, though, when I was in graduate school at NC State in Raleigh, North Carolina, the Raleigh News and Observer, which is no friend of any of us here, well, I shouldn't say that. They have reporters. We have a lot of reporter friends. But anyway, one of the reporters came out when Eisenhower had chosen Dick as vice presidential running mate and wanted my impression. He said, what did you think? I said, well, I was dumbfounded. I was really amazed. I was surprised. The headline in the Raleigh News and Observer is vice presidential nominee is dumbfounded. That's the headline. This is typical of headline hunters who sell papers because, unless you can make some funny news or make fun of somebody, these are my observations, you're not going to sell a paper. If it's not bad enough news, people use it as birdcage liner. So newspapers were something that I really wasn't interested in, but I do appreciate the thoroughness that can come into writing that is lost in just a dialogue on television or radio. Somebody writing something down has thought it through, and it's important. So I read the article and I decided I didn't need to talk to any more reporters. That's what happened. But when it happened in 1967, before the 68 run, Dick had been all over the country in the 60s, campaigning for Republicans and conservatives. When he got to 1967, he had things in his mind, and that mission was welling up again, things he wanted to do, and yet the country was in dire trouble. It was sick and getting sicker. So I drove down to Portland, Oregon from Seattle when he was up to make a speech there to a business group, and I said, I have not participated in your other high office elections, and I'd like to get involved in this if you decide to go this time. So in 1968, he asked me to come back, work in the campaign in New York, the old American Bible Society building, which was taken over in toto for the campaign. And so I was there in the 68 campaign, composing responses to mail that was directed to the candidate and signing it on behalf of my brother, Humpty Hump. And we'd have about 76 volunteers that would read all this incoming mail and then assign certain responses, and a form letter would go out with my signature. That can get you in trouble. If you don't read what you're signing, you've got to be very careful. So anticipating presidential runs, that's as much as I can tell you. I was averse to politics in the first place. Important as it is, somebody has to do it, and I hope the best will do it. But I'm more interested in what lies beyond this time and where were we before the Big Bang. That's my mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed Nixon. He honors our boardroom frequently because he's active in this institution's management and leadership, but we seldom get him to the podium. But Ed, you have to promise you'll come back for a lecture and book signing when your book is published. Will you do that? Yes. Thank you. Speaking of the book, the Nixons, we have a brochure which I'm holding in my formerly nicotine-stained fingers, that is in our gift shop. So if you'd like to be on the mailing list and know when the book comes out, fill it out, put your name and address, leave it in the gift shop, or mail it to the publisher. I hope you leave it in the gift shop so we can sell you the book, but we'll make sure that you know about it when it comes out. And these are available in the gift shop as you leave. As many of you know, I hope, yesterday we opened our newest exhibit, The President and the King, on the outfits that Elvis Presley and President Nixon wore during that historic meeting in 1970. And we issued this wonderful mug to commemorate that. Those of you who have been here before with our speakers know that we never let them leave the stage without a lavish gift. Something... Oh, you've been here before. All right, you know better. But not to be outdone by previous gifts, this one, a family heirloom, I'm sure, because it has the image of Nixon and Elvis, and then it has the Nixon Library imprinted on it. Ed Nixon, with pleasure, I present this valuable... That's for coffee late at night when you're finishing your book. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. Lunch is served in our museum store. Well, sandwiches, fruit, beverages, coffee, cookies, and so forth. We hope you'll come back. Thank you for coming today.